everybody. We're going to wait for a few minutes until people get into the room. I hope everybody's having a good day so far. But in Gainesville, we've been deluged with about 4 inches of rain, and I think it's coming south. So good luck to you all, and be safe. So if you don't mind, why don't you, for the next 2 minutes, put into the chat box where you all are from. We'd like to know who's listening, and you know, we've got a Flagler and a Volusia County, Hillsborough County. Wow, it's coming fast. Polk and Manatee and North Miami. Wow, you guys are fast today. Palm Beach, Jack's Beach, Seminole, St. John's. I think everybody. Key West, Margaritaville, South Carolina. That sounds fun. Let's see, Port St. Lucie. You guys answered that really fast. And let's see what else. Lake County. Let's see what time it is here. All right, it's 11 o'clock. I am going to, let's see here. Let me get there we go. I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar here. Welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program's Homeowner Webinar Series. My name is Jen Marvin. I'm the Florida Yards and Neighborhoods statewide coordinator for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. Today we have Dr. Brett Bultemeier speaking about organic pesticide safety. Your microphones have been muted. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Also, please stick around until the end of the presentation to take the survey. It will automatically pop up on your browser. It helps me give you the kind of programming you would like to see, and lets us know that how we're doing, you know, on giving you that information. Our next presentation will be July 18th at 11 a.m. Eastern with Dr. AJ Lindsay, giving us a turf update for homeowners. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Brett Bultemeier with the IFAS Pesticide Information Office. Go ahead, Doctor.
All right, I'll do a quick check. If I can get a few thumbs up, can you hear me in the chat? Give me a thumbs up or yes, we can. That would be fantastic, because then I know, one, that you're actually able to hear me, and two, that you're able to find those keyboards, because I'm going to have some audience participation. Second question, can you see my screen? Is it showing you the proper PowerPoint view and you're seeing my slide? I'm seeing some thumbs up. It seems like we're good to go. So
yes,
I will do a little bit more of an introduction. I am with the IFAS Pesticide Information Office, which a lot of times gets confused for, oh, you can give me recommendations on what products to use and where. And that's not really what our office does. We are primarily concerned about pesticide safety. Part of that is helping to organize the state's licensing program, so making sure that there are manuals and exams for those professional applicators that use pesticides, but then also general pesticide safety that provides information to the public at large. Pesticides are often a topic that folks don't know a whole lot about, so our office is here to share the information that we can. Now, with that, a lot of folks think that being with the Pesticide Information Office, that means I must be very pro or very anti-pesticide. And hopefully, as we work through this presentation, you'll see that it's not as clearly binary as that, right? And that my goal is to provide the best information that I can so that everybody can make the decision based on that information that makes the most sense for them. For example, I am a licensed applicator, have worked with pesticides for nearly 20 years. There is a level of comfort there, but in my spare time, I also have a native pollinator garden that is all native plants, and that by being a pollinator garden has a very different use of tools than I may do for my citrus tree that's infested with aphids. So it isn't a binary pro, anti, any of that. The goal is to look at all of the information, make the best decision that you can for yourself and your situation, and that is where we're going to go. So hopefully this lets you in a little bit on me. One of my hobbies is native plant restoration. So we have this very formal pollinator garden, but then I also live on some acreage that we are slowly converting into more native prairie. So that's one of my interests. Yes, my background is in pesticides. I did my graduate work here at the University of Florida. Go Gators. I never miss an opportunity. Studying aquatic invasive species, and then worked in private industry for about 7 years when I left with my PhD, again in aquatics, but then kind of got pulled into the mosquito world, and then ultimately shifted a little bit more from kind of technical support and sales into operations, where I shifted more to safety. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to mention some of the specifics that go with organic pesticides and those definitions, but really this is going to be safety in general. And so if we're going to do that, we've got to figure out how we got here in the first place. So here's maybe your second surprise of the day. Yes, the pesticide safety guy is quoting Shakespeare. It doesn't happen often, but here we are. What is past is prologue. To understand where we are today, we have to understand where things were and how fundamental a shift that was to getting us where we are today. So if we go back into the hazy history of pesticides, it wasn't always great, right? We don't see any safety equipment in this photo. We see what looks like a young lady on a horse-drawn carriage with pesticides being sprayed with probably very little thought. Pesticides were not done as this prescription-based small treatment thing. It was people dumping stuff off the side of a truck. And this is where we were. And the public as a whole didn't look at this with the same eyes we do, right? We look at this and see something very different than what they saw. To a lot of the folks that back then, pesticides were almost like magic for what they meant for controlling insects that spread disease, helping with farming. And there wasn't as much thought to, well, what else could be going on? So in 1947, you had the passage of FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It said all of these things that are controlling things, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is going to control that. So there was legislation and some sort of control even back then. That control, however, really only regulated what was in the jug, and it was from the perspective of this consumer. It was, if you put something in a jug, it had better be in there, it had better be what you said, and if you say that it kills something, it needs to actually do that. So the entire purpose of this entire act was to protect the consumer from fraud. Now that's very different from where we are today, but it wasn't a thought that many people had. And I use this photo to illustrate that. So we, with today's lens, see a truck that says DDT, powerful insecticide, and immediately alarm bells are going off, right? We know all of the impacts that DDT had in the environment, that it's still in the environment today. But the question I ask you, the audience, is, are those children running away from that plume or running toward that plume? So if we were to see a truck doing this, it would be 911 and it would be a major problem. Back then, that's not how society viewed pesticides, right? We talked a little bit about how they were almost seen as this magic bullet. They were curing things that for most of history did not have much of a cure. And there wasn't as much thought on, well, what else could be going on? Environmentalism wasn't necessarily a thing when you had pictures like this. However, as we started seeing very widespread use of these products, you started to get a shift to more of an environmental awareness. We started connecting things. Hey, the environment is this big web of things, and if one thing gets sick, it can impact the other. Again, we take this for granted today, but back then that was not the case. And you started seeing people going, hey, wait a minute, maybe environmentalism should be more than just, we have these national parks that we can go to. Maybe we should be really thinking about all of these. And it starts to coalesce with the publishing of Silent Spring in 1962. As somebody that works in pesticides, probably one of the most important books that was written that relates to pesticides. And it was so important because what Rachel Carson did was really took what people were seeing in isolation and feeling, but couldn't put their fingers on, and gave voice to that and said, hey, something needs to happen. There are things that don't seem to be right. And we started to see a change in the sentiment of the public. We went from these are magical things that are doing things to change society to, ooh, there may be some problems here that we need to look deeper into. And several of those things that happened, one of which was Agent Orange used in Vietnam. And for those that don't know, what caused the problems is the cheap manufacture of putting these two herbicides together actually introduced dioxin into that mix. And if any of you know anything about dioxin, it is a terrible, terrible poison. So this byproduct of the manufacture caused a lot of people to be sick. So you had folks coming back from Vietnam saying, hey, I was around this spray and now I don't feel good, and starting to connect a spray of maybe I don't run to it. Maybe we need to ask what's really happening here. And it wasn't just pesticides. This is where we're going to make the jump from where we were to where we are today with the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. Now, I'm not going to say that folks back then would have thought this was normal. We've talked about how the environmental thought back then wasn't the same as it is now, but I'm pretty sure all of humanity can recognize rivers catching fire is not what they're supposed to do. And so we go from, we don't really need to worry about all these things that are happening, and crossing over into the color side of that photograph, looking at it with today going, something has to change. And again, you've got Rachel Carson's book sitting there going, hey, maybe we should start thinking about this whole system. In some ways, Rachel Carson doesn't get the credit for being one of the early ecologists that I think maybe she should. So these are terrible images, and they truly were bad practices. The only regulation that was in place is what was in the jug needed to be, what you said was in there is what needed to be in there. So change was absolutely needed. You have this voice in this collection of people saying something has to happen. And now we get the formation of EPA in 1970. Now, EPA doesn't just deal with pesticides, it does all kinds of other things. You know, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, that was an industrial spill. But if we are protecting the environment, pesticides are in that environment, we've got to find a way to pull them in. So what the EPA did is it just took FIFRA away from USDA and said, you're going to come here to EPA. And now we're asking very different questions. It's not just is what you say is in there and does it work? In fact, it became a whole lot less about does it work and about all the other things we associate with pesticide registration. So it's not just the consumer. So before it was protecting me from buying snake oil. Now it's about protecting me from harm and protecting the environment and other people. We care about what is in that jug and what it's doing. So really shifting from protecting me from buying something that isn't right, that's a lie, into protecting people and the environment. And the EPA statement on pesticides is that when used according to the label, they do not pose unreasonable risk of harm to people or the environment. Now, it doesn't say no risk, it says unreasonable risk. And there's lots of discussion as to what is unreasonable and what isn't. So now EPA is going from a program to check what's in a jug and make sure it works, and to having to do a whole lot more testing on what does this product do, where is it going, how are we going to get that information out, and ultimately, how are we going to enforce this? Because it's one thing to write rules, but if there's no way to enforce that, it doesn't matter. So what we're going to talk about here for a little bit is pesticide registration. So what do these products have to go through before they ever make it out into the environment? And through this process that we have today, a product like DDT wouldn't make the cut. In fact, a lot of our products that were from the before times didn't make the cut and still wouldn't now. So what is getting registered? Well, what gets registered are pesticides and pesticide devices. We're not going to spend much time, if any, on devices. We're going to focus on pesticides. And this is simply a substance that prevents, destroys, repels, or mitigates any kind of pest. So it stops or alleviates the impacts of a pest. And a pest is just something that causes harm. So if I'm a farmer, it could be a bug that is eating my crop and reducing my yield. If I am a public health county director, it may be I am using something to repel mosquitoes that cause disease. You get the idea. There's a lot of places that these are used. So a pesticide is mitigating in some way a pest. We won't really get into a device other than to say a fly swatter doesn't count as a device because it requires my skill to wield it. But some of the attractants and traps are actually devices, and they do get registered by EPA. So pesticides. In the chat, how many, when you hear pesticide, the first thing you think of is, well, this kills insects, right? Most folks that I come across, they say, well, pesticide, that's just insects, right? It just controls insects. Well, think of pesticides like the big general statement. If I said alcohol, well, you're going, well, is that beer? Is that wine? Is that bourbon? Is it rum? Is it all of these varieties? Pesticide is the big term. And then we get more specific with something like a herbicide that controls plants, an insecticide that controls insects. And then you get the idea that there are tons of things that these pesticides work on. And for those of you that remember your Latin, what comes before is what it is controlling, and side means to control. And this includes things like wood preservatives, growth regulators. You get the idea. There's a ton of products. So if pesticides are what is being registered, who's involved in this process? Well, the first is going to be some company or manufacturer that wants to sell this product, right? I found Brett's secret sauce and I want to sell this. Well, now I've got to work with the EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs to begin that whole process. But it's not just these two. There are lots of other agencies that begin to touch this process. If you are dealing with Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, you're pulling FDA into the EPA process. That we are using in some cases for crops, aircraft, FAA may be involved in the registration process. DOT, the National Organic Program, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and even OSHA, that these are being used in a workplace. All of these groups are not only weighing in on registration, but then ultimately how it's used after the fact. All right, now the big question, how does this get done? I am not going to give you every nitty-gritty detail because that's actually a whole separate presentation. It's like a 2 or 3-parter. There is a tremendous amount of detail that goes into the registration process, but we're going to keep it very simple here. It is a pile of data. It can take upwards of a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars to get a product registered. And that cost is because of the questions that must be answered. So there are 243 questions that the EPA says must be answered before a product is registered. Now, when I say question, some of those may be real simple. Some of these questions are as simple as, well, what's the molecular weight of this product? That's a pretty simple answer, right? Some of these questions, it's not a single experiment. It's not 2 experiments. A single question may be dozens and dozens of experiments. So you can imagine in answering 243 questions, there's a whole lot of research that's going on. There's a manual that's about that thick that is just on how to collect data. No, not how to collect the specific data for each of those questions. These are all of the requirements for any data that you will ever collect for the EPA. There's a whole separate book for each of those questions that must be asked. And it is very strict guidelines on how you answer that, what goes into that, who can do it, what their labs are like, how often they're certified. You get the idea. It is just a mountain of data that EPA is going to go through. And we really want this process in place because it's going to catch things, hopefully, before they become a problem. So what sort of data are they collecting? What are these questions? Well, there are 40 questions related to chemistry, things like at what point does it burn? Does it become a vapor? All of the things you can think about with chemistry. There are 55 questions about toxicity on skin, in eyes, in a whole bunch of different areas that must be answered. Non-target organisms, what's the impact on each of those? And you can imagine if I'm looking at the impact of one organism, that's not just a single study, that can be multiple studies. There are 47 that deal with applicator safety and what happens after the application goes out as far as people are concerned. Drift, there's only 2 questions there. But again, think about drift. That is, how far into the water will it go and under what conditions will it move? In the air, how far will it move? What might it do once it gets there? So drift may only be 2 questions, but you can imagine the amount of research that goes into that. Environmental fate, where is this going to go and does it stick around? And that's a really big one. The 2 big killers up front for any product will be that it does not break down. So it's like DDT, a forever legacy chemical, or one that will bioaccumulate. So that means smaller little critters will eat that pesticide. It will stay in them. Bigger critters will eat a lot of those smaller critters and get a much bigger dose, and it will move its way up the chain. This is something DDT would do. It would bioaccumulate. And then finally, residue. How long does this stuff stick around on food? Because if we're using pesticides for growing food, we want to know if I'm eating cornflakes with milk, how much of that pesticide may have been on that? How are we going to test for that? All of those questions. And ultimately, what EPA is looking to do is a relationship that we are going to talk about for the remainder of this presentation, because it is the relationship that all safety is built on. And it is defining hazards to ultimately reduce something we're going to talk about in just a second. And a hazard is simply something that has the potential to cause harm. There's potential for something bad to happen there, right? And if we're talking about pesticides, this is toxicity. If it gets on my skin or in my body, it's going to cause me harm. Now, toxicity is a specific type of hazard, different from, say, I'm doing mechanical control with a hoe and I smash it against my shin. That's a harm, but it's a very different harm than toxicity. So let's step away from chemicals and let's talk about a hazard that is posed by a gator, right? So if we look at these majestic creatures, they have sharp teeth, they've got powerful jaws, they've got these claws. It used to be on a football field, they could run like the wind. If you put a bat in their hand, they're pretty darn dangerous. Go Gators. So there is potential for harm to occur here. Now, a hazard on its own doesn't cause any harm. So if I'm looking at that beautiful, majestic gator from inside my office using binoculars to see it in the ponds, yeah, it's a hazard. There's potential for harm, but it's not real likely. If I go up to that same gator, now none of the hazard has changed, but now I have dramatically increased my exposure, there is a much higher likelihood of harm. And this is what we're talking about with all safety. It is the relationship of identifying and quantifying a hazard, understanding the chance of us coming into contact with that hazard, and that equals our risk. And EPA's entire thing is about mitigating risk. We go back to that statement, when used according to the label, does not cause unreasonable risk of harm. So everything they're doing is mitigating and managing risk, and it's what our office focuses on as it relates to pesticides. But as you'll see, it's more than just pesticides we can apply this logic to. So again, for there to be risk, there must be a hazard, the potential for harm, and potential exposure to that harm. Now, when we're talking about pesticides, hazard is a whole lot harder to change, right? We can't change what the nature of a pesticide is. So most of EPA's thing is, if a pesticide isn't so hazardous that they say there's no way we can register this, they're managing exposure. How can we reduce that exposure to either the applicator or to everybody else and the environment? So what they're doing is they are looking to get exposure limits. What is acceptable and how do we get to that point? So they define very clearly the toxicity of these products and what is their possible exposure, how often, at what rate, so on and so forth, to define that risk. Once they've done that rate of toxicity, they're going to build in safety factors. And what you'll see a lot of times with presentations like this, or if you go looking online, is you're going to see terminology like an LD50. And that is simply the point at which 50% of a test population is very negatively impacted. It doesn't always mean dead. but it means they're pretty darn close too. So how much of this does it take to kill 50% of a population? Which is a good point to know, but EPA bases a lot of their decisions on what is called the no observed effect level. So at what point do we not see anything happen, right? That's much more where I'd want to be. It's great to know that that's the amount that will kill 50% of us. I want to know at what point nobody has an impact, right? And what they'll do with this is this will help to classify pesticides and start to put decisions into place. And one of the first ways you're going to see that is in the signal word that goes on the label. And we're going to look at some labels here in a moment, and we're going to take the time to find where those signal words are. But this very quickly can give you information about that product. So you'll see things like caution, warning, danger, and then a danger poison with skull and crossbones. And where that all comes from is in all of those tests, they build these charts that gives them a decision matrix. You don't need to memorize this table. It's just to understand that the words that make their way onto the label come from very real places as part of that registration process. So depending on what it does, if you swallow it, if it's on your skin, if it's in your eyes, it's going to make this decision. Now, EPA registers a product. That's sort of their regulatory piece, but that's not where it ends. Now they have to communicate this information to the wider public, and that comes through pesticide labels. We are going to be spending a little bit of time here to understand what is on a label, but more importantly, how do you navigate through a label? Because this is, no matter what product you're using, understanding the logic behind how it's organized can help you ensure that you're using it in the safest way possible. Now, a label will do three things. It's going to give you safety information. So what do I need to do in order to use this product safely? That's a huge component of what EPA is trying to put out. The other is it keeps you legal. If the label is the law, which is something in my realm I have to say all the time, if it's the law, it is the label that keeps you legal. Reading it and understanding it is what's going to make sure that you are using it according to the law. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse to break it. I cannot tell a police officer, oh, I didn't know it was 40 here. I thought I could go 95. That's not going to work. And it's the same with pesticides. Hey, I didn't know I couldn't do that. Well, it's on the label. Finally, one of the biggest pieces that the label is going to give you is how to use the product effectively. Where can I use it? What can I use it on? How much of it can I use that's going to keep me legal, keep me safe, and have it work effectively? All right, so how do you read the label? I'm giving you a truncated version of this talk that I give to our professional applicators, but now we're going to dig into how do we understand the logic. So the way I look at it is if I just hand you this jug, what is the first question that you're going to ask me? And this is where I'm going to ask some of you to put in the chat. Let's see how you compare to some of my professional applicator audiences. I hand you this jug. What's your first question? And this is almost always what people ask me, right? What in the heck is this? What did you just hand me? I guess your first question could be, who are you and why are you just handing me things? But what the heck is it is what most people want to know. And on that very first part of the label, it's going to tell us that. Now, it's going to give us several pieces that tell us about this product. It's going to give me the trade name or brand name. And then within that, we're going to have something called a common name. So I'm going to do an exercise here. If I say the trade name Roundup, you all say the common name, type it into the chat. So Roundup is, and I'm starting to see it, right? So the common name of Roundup is, in this case, glyphosate. You should be identifying your pesticides by that common name. And we'll get into why you should do that here in just a moment. Now, in addition to the common name, there may be other chemical things. You'll see the chemical symbol, the 1, 2, 4, 5, dihydro, whatever. Or in some cases, professional applicators need to know some of the different salt formulations of particular products. But for the most part, what you need is common name, and then knowing the brand name can help you when you are ordering from a specific manufacturer. Now, what that common name is describing is the active ingredient. This is the part of the pesticide that's doing something, right? So it's the part that is repelling, killing, destroying, mitigating. It's active. Fantastic that there was some logic to this, that the active ingredient is active. Now, that's not the only thing in that formulation. There's the active ingredient, let's say glyphosate in this manner, but there is lots of other things in that jug. And those other things are there to help it spread, to make it smell, to make it not smell, to keep it in solution. It's all the other things. Now, a lot of folks, and I've heard this a lot, will say that nobody knows what those inactive ingredients are, right? Nobody knows what's in there. Well, that is not true. They do not display what those inactive ingredients are because it's considered proprietary. However, the EPA knows every single inactive ingredient that's in that formulation, and only approved inactive ingredients are allowed to be in there. So that's really, really important. Even though it's not listed, it is approved through the EPA, just like the active ingredients. And somebody jumped ahead of me and hit my point. So I'm just going to go buy Roundup. I'm buying this Roundup for lawns. I don't even need to see what that tiny print down there says because the active ingredient's glyphosate, right? No. Let's look at that list of active ingredients. Panoxalam, sulfentrazone, 2,4-dimethylamine salt, and dicamba. If I bought this Roundup and didn't look at the common name, the active ingredients, and thought I was buying glyphosate, this product is not going to work in the exact same way. I'm going to kill things I don't want to kill. I'm going to not control things I want to control. You must always identify your product by active ingredients. So as much as we have gotten into our heads that Roundup is glyphosate, clearly Roundup isn't glyphosate. And there are indeed Roundup products that aren't even herbicides. There is a Roundup insecticide. So identifying by the active ingredient is really important. And hints at you should be reading the label before you purchase a product and before you use a product every single time. All right, so we have identified what it is. What is the next question you want to know? So let's just say that that jug I handed you was Blammo and it has Kilzalzazine. What is your next question to me likely to be? Let's see if anybody gets it in the chat. Oh, see, and it's not just my professional audiences. Somebody said, how do I use it? You all want to get out there and use the product. We're not there yet. We've got to ask, is it dangerous? And this is the very next thing that this label is going to communicate, again, through those signal words. And the first signal word that a label may have is nothing. There are products that are low toxicity enough that the EPA does not require a signal word. Moving into the next level is caution. Slightly more toxic is going to be warning, then danger, and danger, poison, skull, and crossbones. So if we are going to look at the front page of a label, we're very quickly getting information. I see this big box that draws my eye that says restricted use due to acute inhalation toxicity. Only certified applicators can use it. Well, that catches my attention. I look down here and I see danger, poison, skull, and crossbones. Very quickly, I am getting information about this product. All right, so let's say the product I handed you was Blammo, Kilzalzazine, danger, poison, skull, and crossbones. What are you now going to ask me? So let's see if this changes any of your decisions here in the chat. What do you want to know about this product now? And I see residual effects. PPE, that's a pretty good guess. PPE, we'll get there in a second. I want to know, what do I do if it gets on me? So what happens if this product gets on me? Very next part of a label is first aid. How do I get it out of my eyes, off my skin? All of that information is very next on the label. So we've got what it is it dangerous? What if it gets on me? Which leads us to where a lot of you wanted to go. How do I keep it off of me? What is my PPE? So this is going to be in the precautionary statements, and PPE will vary greatly. If we look at this example, there's like 4 different little subsections that tell me about PPE. And if we look at the list, it's like everything. It's coveralls, gloves, footwear, eyewear, pretty much everything but the respirator. However, that's not what all labels are going to look like. If we look at this one, we see it says long sleeved shirt, long pants, shoes, plus socks. Don't need gloves, don't need eyewear. I can do anything that I want. So that's another example of PPE. If we look at something like a homeowner product, we may see something like this. Causes moderate eye irritation, avoid contact with eyes or clothing. There is no PPE required for this. That it says keep off of clothing, it does imply that I can't be nude while I apply this product. And I would say that's a general order that the rest of society is pretty pleased that we wear clothes while we apply pesticides. But there is no set PPE. And this is important because I tell my professional audiences all the time, do not tell your applicators to just wear the standard PPE because there is no standard PPE. The PPE will be given to you on the label, and you should follow the instructions on the label. And not should, you must at a minimum wear what is listed on the label. And for those that were asking me to go back, here's the points. We're going to keep building on this. So there's a theme that we have developed with these first 4 points. And that theme is personal safety. This is all about communicating to me, the person using the product. I know what it is because that matters no matter where I am. I know if it's dangerous, what if it gets on me, and how to keep it off of me. Because as the user, this matters no matter where I'm using it, when I'm using it, how I'm using it. That is most important, so it is upfront on the label. But we're not ready to use this product yet because we have to make sure that we don't hurt other things. So now we are moving into the environmental hazard section, which is going to talk about who can be in this area when it is treated. What do we need to do to protect the environment? And you can see the B box here. This is about protecting pollinators. So it's going to give you very specific instructions that make sure that we're meeting that requirement of the EPA, that it doesn't cause unreasonable risk of harm to people or the environment. And up front on this label, we have now covered safety. And this is always at the beginning of the label because it will always matter, right? Now we're finally ready to go do what you all wanted to do and use this stuff. But before we get there, let's see if labels truly hold to this format. So let's just take a random label. Here's an insecticide. We see up front the brand name. We get some information about it. We see the active ingredient with the common name, signal word, first aid, PPE, environmental hazards. All right, so that one held up to my logic. Here's our herbicide. Now it's the same company, but does it hold? We see a brand name. We see our active ingredient. Notice we don't see a signal word, and that's because this doesn't require one. But if we keep moving on, we see first aid, PPE, environmental hazards. Even our mosquito products, here's a restricted use product that has what it is, first aid, PPE, and we go to the next page, environmental hazards. Some of them will even put all of this information on the very first page, what it is, first aid, PPE, environmental hazards. So safety is up front because safety always matters, right? Well, now that we've got safety covered, now we're ready to use the product. And this is going to be the largest part of a label. It's going to give you things like, hey, in agriculture, here's your restricted entry interval. How long do you need to keep people out? What are the things you need to do on a farm? It's going to tell me, what do I do for resistance management? How do I mix this in my tank? What can I mix it with? What sorts of equipment can I use? Where can I use this? All of those do not statements, all of those do statements, all of these things are enforceable. Now, the directions for use vary greatly among the pesticides, and they can be very long and very detailed. These can be the portion that are written by lawyers for lawyers, but there is still logic in this directions for use. And it's really, really important to understand that safety was up front because it always matters no matter where I'm using it. As we start getting into the where you can use it, you've got to follow the same logic. So in the directions for use, that first section applies to everybody. It doesn't matter where you're using the product. Those bullet points in that paragraph that is listed there will apply to everybody. Now, my background was in aquatics, so I can just jump straight to my aquatics use section, right? No. So it'll say directions for use, all the things up there matter, and then maybe it will say for agricultural uses. Well, that doesn't apply to me, but I still can't skip to aquatics. There's a section that says non-ag uses. Oh, that applies to me. Here's 5 bullet points, and a paragraph that tells me all non-ag uses must follow this. And then it's things like crack and crevice treatment, that's not me. Forestry, that's not me. Aquatic sites, that is me. Beginning paragraph is going to apply to all aquatics, and then it's going to move down rivers, lakes, ponds, whatever it is I'm using. So you cannot just skip to what pest can I control and what rate do I need to use. You've got to move through those directions for use in a very similar manner. All right, so we are almost done with a label, right? But we still have one more thing. We've got to go from cradle to grave on this, and we've got to figure out how do we dispose of or store this for future use. Now, on many professional products, this is at the very end of the label, which makes sense to me. It's the last thing we do. On some of your homeowner products, storage and disposal is going to be up near the front. So before we move on, I do see that there is a question. I'm working with an online training about combined products. I have found surprising that the labels in this area have a very lax label. Yeah, we'll get into some of those labels that may be not required. And this is actually leading into my next point. Is everything registered with EPA? And the answer to that is kind of no. So all pesticides must be, but there is this little subset that EPA has identified called 24B products. And these are minimum risk pesticides. And these don't require the full registration by EPA. These are products that have been identified as generally less toxic. The EPA has done research on them in general, but doesn't really restrict some of those uses. So the EPA does not require registration for 24B products. Hold that in your mind because us in Florida have a very different relationship with 24Bs. These are still pesticides, however. Just because the EPA doesn't register them and require some of the labeling and all of that, they are pesticides. They are controlling a pest, and that is really important as a definition here in Florida that we'll get to in just a moment. So what qualifies for a 24B? Well, it's one of the handful of listed products. The inert ingredients, just like on a fully registered pesticide, must be approved as well. The ingredients must be listed on a label, but it's not as strict as the other information that must be on the label. But you cannot use these products for any human health or disease control claims. So a 24B product could not skip EPA registration if I were, for example, making a claim that it could control Zika carrying mosquitoes. So there are still some limitations even within these products. And basically the company must put their information and they can't make any misleading statements. If you are interested in what these products are, you can take a picture of that QR code on the screen and it will take you to the EPA's information about minimum risk pesticides. But this is ultimately the list of those products. It is not very many. And you can see that there are those that are approved for non-food use and a smaller subset that are approved for food use. So if I were growing vegetables in my garden that I'm going to sell at the farmer's market, I could not use cedar wood oil to do that. But you can see some of these products that you may have some familiarity with: garlic, zinc, citronella oil, clove oil, garlic oil, some of the things that we do see in other types of production. However, we're going to take a little bit of a detour here and talk about specifically this state of Florida. So everything so far has been federal, right? EPA registers these products. They give this list of what must be done. They require all of this test, but then they still give a lot of authority to the states. They say, states, you can actually be more restrictive if you want, and you can choose to only allow certain products into your state. And we're also making sure that you're going to license people that use these products. And here in Florida, that is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Again, they can be more restrictive. And in this case, Florida is more restrictive, that 24B products require registration in the state of Florida. So they are doing this state registration, they are licensing applicators, and then they are ultimately the ones inspecting, finding, enforcing, carrying all those pieces out. Now, if you're wondering how those laws work in Florida, there are three main laws, and these were passed by legislature, that all pesticide applicators fall under. The first is going to be mosquito control, Chapter 388. So this is all the the trucks and the flying and the control that is done on mosquitoes. 42 is what we call our structural pest control. So this is going to be buildings, houses, and then the lawns associated with them. So termite treatments, all the lawn treatments that are done, they fall under this chapter. And then finally, we have agriculture, so traditional farming, and then kind of everything else. So that I did aquatics, I fall under 487 because it's not dealing with mosquitoes and it's not dealing with a house. And much of my time is spent navigating through where do you fall in these 3 chapters and mitigating through all of the rules associated with it. We're not going to dig into these. If you ever need sleep, I would encourage you to read the Florida statutes and rules. It will put you to sleep. But one of the things that it does stipulate is Florida requires 24B state registrations. So that list of products that I had requires registration with the state of Florida. So if you are using it as a pesticide, then it needs registration. So if I am selling this product in the state, or I am selling my services with those products, I must use registered products. And this is where it starts to get a little more tricky. So if I'm on my own property using those minimum risk products, the state may not require any registration for that. But if I'm going to buy it in Florida, the company selling it has to register for the state. And if I'm going to treat my neighbor's yard and get a case of beer in payment for that, I have now made pesticide claims, and whatever I'm using must be registered. All right, let's get a little more further nuanced into these products and talk about biopesticides. And this is something relatively new that EPA is doing to start separating organic production from what used to be called organic pesticides. So a biopesticide is generally considered less toxic than conventional products. And this is directly according to the EPA. And what it allows for is a much faster registration. So if I have a product that is derived from animal, plant, bacteria, or certain minerals, I am somewhat fast-tracked into my registration process. Again, I talked about registration can take a very long time. EPA is saying that biopesticides have a much faster track, and we're going to get them out there. So an example of a biopesticide could be some of the mosquito products that are derived from crushed chrysanthemum flowers. Now, this is a very similar chemical to our synthetic pyrethroids, but instead of coming from a synthetic process, it is actually crushing up chrysanthemum flowers, distilling that down, and using that as a treatment. Another major example of biopesticides would be BT. So these are bacteria that have proteins that end up controlling eating caterpillars and bugs that chew on plants. So what happens is that bacteria and protein gets into the insect's guts, it damages it, and those insects die. So pest feeding on plants that have been treated with BT don't survive. So those that are kind of familiar, this may sound a little bit like neonic pesticides, that it's incorporated into the plant, the insects feed on it and it kills them, but that it comes from a bacteria, it falls under this biopesticide. Now, this is where it starts to get confusing because many of our biopesticides are also approved for organic production. Yes, organic production uses pesticides. It just has a very specific list that you can use. Now, we talked about biopesticides are considered less toxic. Does this mean that they're just the choice for everything? My goodness, you've told me about this BT. I'm just going to spray it everywhere. Does this fit every plan, every scenario? And hopefully you're all screaming, of course it doesn't. It depends on what I'm trying to do. So let's say I am a caladium grower and I have developed this amazing caladium at my property that I'm going to take to the county show. And if I can win that county show, it may get picked up by a company and I'm going to be the caladium king of Florida. Well, I may not want to allow any bugs to chew on that. And so using a product that requires them to eat that product could be a bit of a problem. So I may not want BT for that. So already it's not of a use. Well, what about, now I got parsley or some vegetables I'm growing and these aphids are just wearing me out. I don't really care about the damage so long as I'm able to harvest my crop. Well, that might be okay, unless you're someone like me that has a native pollinator garden, and I don't like the aphids either, but I do have these butterflies that feed on these plants as caterpillars. And if I use BT, I'm now controlling the butterflies as well. So it's not that biopesticide just means, oh, everything's fine, I don't have to take any consideration in. We have to think through what we are trying to do no matter what, which leads us to IPM, or integrated pest management. Now, I'm not going to go through a big lecture on all of what IPM is. We are simply going to state that IPM is about knowing what your goals are and building a plan around that. So what am I trying to do? What are all of the tools that are available to me? How can I leverage these tools together to achieve my goal now and long term? So it isn't pesticides first. It isn't pesticides last. It is understanding my goals, understanding my pests, and selecting from all of the things that are available to develop that plan. You know, we kind of walked through this here. There are tons of tools available to me, but it all depends on what my goal is as to what tools I may use, how I may leverage them, and when I'm going to use them. So it's not the same choice every single time. It is goal dependent. And organic pesticides fall into this goal. Organic production is really a choice of goals, right? It is saying that I am going to do this growing while minimizing reliance upon conventional pesticides. And within that, there are biopesticides approved for organic production. But think about organic production as this is a very specific goal I have, and this is what I'm going to do. So yes, there are pesticides in organic production, but there are very specific rules as to what is used. So for organic production, you must consider soil and water quality guidelines. And there are very specific guidelines that if you're going to be an organic producer, you would have to submit to be certified as organic. You cannot use synthetic fertilizers, sewage sludge, and there are very specific rules about where you can use manure. Again, it is building a plan, it is having a goal and having that approved. No GMO, there needs to be buffers between your property and any using conventional pesticides. And again, those plans are reviewed. So what are some examples of organic approved pesticides? Well, one would be copper sulfate. And any of us that are in the aquatic realm recognize that as a conventional pesticide as well. We mentioned those bacteria products, some of the BTs, some other examples, hydrogen peroxide, the pyrethrin that comes from chrysanthemum. Beer is listed as an approved organic product. Garlic, sticky traps, horticultural vinegar, horticultural soaps. These are all approved. Now, does an organic product have a similar look to conventional? It sure does. How do I know if what I'm using is an organic product? Most of them will have somewhere on their label a listing for organic gardening, or it will somehow specify that this is an organic product. So we can see here our brand name, we have our active ingredients, we have our signal word, and we move on, we have our PPE and our environmental hazards, right? Here's one that we used to use in mosquito control. Yes, a mosquito control product is for use in organic production. So it's those pyrethrins. This has brand name. We have our common name, our environmental hazards, PPE directions for use. So if these are 24B in a lot of cases, why do they have a label in the first place? So many companies that have 24B, one, here in the state of Florida, you must have a label, but it's also an easier pathway that a lot of the folks that produce organic or biopesticides also do synthetic pesticides. So this allows them to just stick with the same process that they've always done and go forth. It also ensures that people are using their product properly. A label is a very great way to inform what you're going to do. It can also distinguish and lend credibility. I know if I'm in a store and I see something that has a label and it has EPA numbers and all of that, I go, boy, they've really done their work, especially knowing what I know about 24B, they went above and beyond. Which leads us to, what about homemade pesticides? Can I just make my own out of all the articles I see on the internet and go forth and spray? And the answer is maybe. There are some instances where that's legal. There's instances where it's illegal. But what we're really talking about with homemade pesticides is there's a big piece that's missing. And what's missing is all of that data. So the 24B products that do go through registration have checked these boxes. The compounds that are listed on a 24B have gone through these boxes, but a homemade pesticide hasn't. We are often lacking safety and efficacy data. So the answer is we just don't know. And don't confuse familiarity with safety. Many of us, I'm sure, are very comfortable with Tylenol, with using bleach, with using products that were around all the time. If we stack up the toxicity of some of those products to pesticides, they are way more toxic, but we're familiar with them. And I think with a lot of homemade remedies, that's what you're dealing with. I'm familiar with these products. They must be safe. And that may not be the case. In Florida, homemade recipes may require registration. If you are using it on your own property, there may not be any reason to have it registered. But if you have a pest control company that is saying we're going to use a home remedy, it must be registered. If you are doing this for your neighbors and your friends and family and you are receiving any sort of compensation, it must be registered. So homemade pesticides might be illegal as well. And this is important because all of these subjects are going to fit into, I'm going to skip along to catch us up, this relationship between hazard and exposure equaling risk, right? So if we are talking about toxic substances, these are some of the signs that we can get if we are exposed to a pesticide. And I want to highlight some of these symptoms are headache. Let's look at excessive perspiration that can lead to death. There's something else that we deal with here in Florida that can cause all of those symptoms as well, and that is heat stress. So when we are making our decisions for any sort of activity, it's knowing our hazard. I understand the sun and all that it can do. I understand my exposure to that sun, and I can make decisions to reduce my risk. And the more decisions we're making, so I'm going to use a pesticide. The label just says to wear long sleeve shirt and pants, but I'm going to put on the full suit. Well, maybe I've reduced my minimal risk to the pesticide, but in July in Florida, wearing a respirator, Tyvek suit, and all of that has increased my risk to sun. So no matter what decisions you are making for your management plans, be thinking about what are my hazards, what's my exposure, and how do I reduce my risk. So pesticide registration is a very tedious process, even for some of those products that don't require the full registration. There is still much data that has been vetted going into it. Most of the products you're going to come about are still going to be registered. Remember that IPM is not simply a listing of tools. It is a way to make a plan and a decision that fits for you and your goals. And safety isn't simply a checklist. It is understanding that relationship between hazard, exposure, and risk. And I believe with that, we can motor back through some of the questions.
All right, thank you.
And go back to some of the slides.
Yeah, all right. So one thing I wanted you to clarify, and I can't remember if you said it, the difference between, I think you said soap and insecticidal soap, or vinegar and insecticidal vinegar.
So there are products that are those biopesticides that would be, say, a horticultural vinegar. And that horticultural vinegar is going to be a much higher concentration than the vinegar that you have from your house. And will typically come with a label giving you instructions, safety information, because a horticultural vinegar is going to be much more risky for burning your skin than the vinegar that we're all used to.
Yeah, and so you can't necessarily just take something from your kitchen and use it as a, combine it and use it as a pesticide.
Correct. So I assume this is, somebody said go back to the biopesticide. Did you mean the 24B or biopesticides?
Let's see.
Maybe they'll respond in the chat. If it was the one where I talked about some of the examples of biopesticides, that's very different. These are the 24B are reduced risk. Some of the 24B are biopesticides. It gets very confusing.
Okay. The bee picture is very helpful on the label. Are more pictures like fish, birds, pets coming in the future?
So I would say yes. And where we can look to an example is the safety data sheets that always come with every pesticide. That's OSHA's realm. And those have all been harmonized. So that is a requirement that they all be in exactly the same order with pictures. And there's a lot of talk that the EPA wants to push pesticides that way as well. And I would be a pretty big fan of that.
Okay. Let's see. Does diatomaceous earth need an FDAX label 24B?
It probably would.
Okay.
I can check on that for sure and send a
Okay.
follow-up,
That would
but
be great.
that you would be making some sort of pesticidal claim. They're probably going to require it be registered.
Okay. Let's see. Does a worm casting product require a 24B registration? Isn't that considered a soil? Well, somebody else said, isn't that considered a soil additive rather than a pesticide?
So, and here's where we get into this nuance of there are things that can be pesticidal, but if you're using worm casting as a soil amendment, then it wouldn't have any sort of pesticidal claims. If you are selling it for the purpose of this is going to kill pesticides or kill a pest, now you're making a pesticidal claim. FDAX may have some requirements there.
Okay. What is the REI?
So REI is restricted entry interval. And so that means in agriculture, if you spray a product, it is how long people must stay out of that field before they do things like harvest the crops, scout for insects, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Let's see. One of our agents said that brand names are helpful for residential extension agents since our clientele do not know the common name and they ask for the brand name. If it would be helpful to have a key of common names and associated brand names that are able to be purchased by non-professionals. Do you know, does that exist anywhere?
In various forms, yes. Nothing formal from our office because our concern is it's always changing.
Yeah.
There's nothing inherently wrong with discussing brand names that people will commonly know, but it's making sure they understand, always look at that active ingredient and training folks more to look at active ingredient. I look at it the same way we use common names for flowers and plants and insects. The clearest way to identify them is to use the scientific name.
Yeah. Let's see here. We had a couple of comments about people always riding their bikes behind the mosquito trucks, dad spraying DDT all over their house.
Yep.
Here we go. Let me go back to the new ones here. Oops. Let's see here.
And I see somebody just asked about checking a product registered in Florida, and I am going to send a link in the chat.
That'd be great.
That will absolutely allow you to look at that. I've just got to find where that is. So if there's another question, you can certainly ping that my way while I'm looking.
Why is the pesticide label on the combined product so laxed? This comes from one of our GIBMP teachers. So I'm thinking he wants to have an answer just in case he needs it in class.
So combine like two pesticides combined together,
I think
or the
like
fertilizer?
The weed and feed kind of.
Yeah. So I won't say that they're lax. The same amount of registration thought goes into that. They do try to streamline the labels because it's a much lower use rate. There's much lower use for where you can use them. But those labels, if it is a true weed and feed, absolutely has the information that EPA requires.
Okay. And just so everybody knows, Florida Friendly Landscaping doesn't recommend weed and feed products. So I'm just going to say that out loud. Would tobacco be considered organic pesticide?
It is one of the ones that's listed, and that's because tobacco has that nicotine, which is what the neonicotine pesticides are made from. So it's going to have a similar mode of action, just a different concentration.
All right. So if drift is looked at before a product is approved, what is the deal with dicamba, which seems to have a drift that is unpredictable in what I am reading?
So this is where I get to say that pesticide registration is never done, if this makes sense. So EPA does all they can to look at the data before, but after a product is released, they are continuing to look at that data. And if we look at something like dicamba, they recognize that this was maybe more prone to drift than they had originally thought. And they put extra requirements on who can use it. You must be licensed. There's an extra training you must go through. And they are continuing to evaluate what sorts of things can we put in place to further limit that. And if the answer is we don't think we can, the EPA has the authority to deregister a product.
Okay, let's see here if we got any more.
And I did drop the link into the chat, and it will start with a map, and you can click on Florida and you can search their data, and it will let you search by active ingredient. Takes you to a whole bunch of stuff.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that was the last question. People are asking also, how can we re-review this presentation? In a week or two, we will have it up on both of our archived website, our archived webinar website, and also on YouTube. And then we've just got some, Brett has been very easy to understand, and it was an informative presentation. Great presentation. Thank you. Let's see. There's how many people saw this live? It was about 124. Excuse me. Lots of great presentation. So
I'm happy for the invite. I know when we deal with pesticides, it can sometimes be a touchy subject, but my goal is giving everybody the information to make the best decision for themselves.
Yeah, everybody agrees that you made it very easy to understand. So I really appreciate you coming on here and giving us some insight into pesticide safety. I hope everybody has a great day, and we will see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.